In 2018, something unprecedented happened in the history of German finance. A payments technology company, not a bank, not an industrial giant, not a chemical conglomerate, was added to the DAX 30, Germany's most prestigious stock index. It replaced Commerzbank, one of the oldest financial institutions in the country. The company was called Wirecard, and at that moment it was worth more than Deutsche Bank. This is important to understand. Deutsche Bank had been operating since 1870. It had financed the construction of the Baghdad Railway. It had survived 2 world wars and a hyperinflation that made German currency worth less than the paper it was printed on. It employed nearly 100,000 people worldwide. Wirecard had been founded in 1999 in a suburb of Munich by a quiet, bespectacled Austrian named Markus Braun. The financial world celebrated. Here, finally, was proof that Europe could produce a technology champion to rival Silicon Valley. Germany had its answer to PayPal. Analysts wrote glowing reports. Institutional investors loaded up on the stock. The German government referred to Wirecard as a national success story. There was only one problem. A significant portion of the business did not exist. Wirecard had started as a legitimate company processing payments for online gambling and adult entertainment sites, industries that major banks refused to touch. It was unglamorous, niche work, but it was real. What happened next is a story about how quickly reality can be buried under a sufficiently thick layer of paperwork, ambition, and institutional willingness to believe. By the mid-2010s, Wirecard was claiming explosive growth across Asia. It reported vast revenues flowing through partners in countries like India, the Philippines, Singapore, and Dubai. On paper, these partners were processing billions of euros in payments on Wirecard's behalf, third-party acquiring businesses that dramatically inflated the company's apparent scale and profit. The problem, as investigators and journalists would eventually confirm, was that many of these businesses were largely fictitious. The revenues were fabricated, the contracts were fraudulent, and the cash that was supposed to prove the business was real, the cash sitting in escrow accounts by trustee banks in the Philippines, did not exist. 1.9 billion euros. Never there. But for years, nobody in a position of authority seemed to want to find out. In 2015, a financial journalist at the Financial Times named Dan McCrum began looking into Wirecard's accounts. What he found did not add up. The margins were inconsistent, the geographic revenue claims were difficult to verify. The corporate structure, with its web of Asian subsidiaries and third-party partners, seemed more designed to obscure than to explain. He published his initial findings. Wirecard's stock fell sharply. The company responded not with transparency, but with lawyers. Wirecard hired one of the most aggressive law firms in London and threatened the FT with legal action. It accused the journalists of working in concert with short sellers, investors who profit when a stock falls, to manipulate the market and destroy a legitimate company. The accusations were detailed, forceful, and, as it would later emerge, entirely false, but they were effective. The story of Wirecard became, in much of the German financial press, a story about reckless Anglo-Saxon short sellers attacking a German champion, aided by irresponsible journalism. And then something remarkable happened, remarkable in the worst possible way. Germany's financial regulator, the BaFin, launched an investigation, not into Wirecard, into the journalists. The FT reporters found themselves under formal investigation by a government agency for alleged market manipulation, while the company they were investigating continued to trade, raise debt, and report billions in profit. BaFin also took the extraordinary step of banning short selling in Wirecard stock entirely, a protection almost never granted to a private company. It was, in effect, the German state using its regulatory power to shield a fraud from scrutiny. Wirecard hired a prominent Munich law firm to produce an independent report clearing the company of wrongdoing. The firm obliged. The report was released with grand fanfare and cited widely by analysts recommending the stock. Meanwhile, deep inside the accounts, the fiction kept growing. Every year, Ernst & Young, one of the most respected audit firms in the world, one of the so-called Big Four, signed off on Wirecard's financial statements. They collected their fees, issued clean opinions, and saw nothing, or said they saw nothing, for 10 consecutive years. By early 2020, the pressure had become impossible to contain. A Singapore court released documents from an internal Wirecard investigation that described fabricated contracts, falsified revenue, and a systematic pattern of account manipulation. The FT published the documents. This time, the stock did not just dip, it fell 40% in a single day. Wirecard commissioned an independent audit by the accounting firm KPMG, different from their usual auditor Ernst & Young, to finally settle the matter. The KPMG report, released in April 2020, was devastating in what it did not say. KPMG stated it had been unable to verify most of the revenues from the third-party business. Documents were missing, records were incomplete, key information had been withheld or could not be located. This was not a clean bill of health. This was an auditor saying, as carefully as possible, that they could not confirm the business existed. Within weeks, the endgame began. Ernst & Young, having signed off on the accounts for a decade, suddenly announced they could not sign off on the 2019 annual report. The reason was specific and damning. The 1.9 billion euros held in escrow accounts at 2 Philippine banks, cash that represented the core of Wirecard's liquidity, could not be confirmed. Wirecard said this was a technical delay. The banks would confirm the funds shortly. The banks said something different. They said they had no such accounts. They had no relationship with Wirecard of that nature. The money had never been there. 1.9 billion euros. Never there.
On June 18, 2020, Wirecard admitted publicly what the banks had already confirmed. The 1.9 billion euros was missing, and in the words of the company itself, probably did not exist. 3 words, probably did not exist. A publicly traded company on Germany's premier stock index, worth billions of euros, audited for a decade by one of the largest accounting firms, regulated by a government agency that actively protected it from scrutiny, was now admitting that its single largest cash asset had probably never been real. Within days, Markus Braun resigned as chief executive. He was arrested on June 23, 2020, at Munich Airport. He was charged with market manipulation, accounting fraud, and breach of trust. When he appeared before a parliamentary committee months later, he said one thing of substance. Everything he had done in good faith. He claimed he, too, had been deceived. The man he pointed to was his chief operating officer. Jan Marsalek was, by every account, the operational genius behind Wirecard's global expansion. He was Austrian, like Braun. He was charming, brilliant, and almost pathologically secretive. He spoke multiple languages. He had connections across the intelligence world of half a dozen countries. He traveled constantly, often without obvious business reason, to destinations including Russia, Libya, and various former Soviet states. Colleagues described him as a man who seemed to know things he should not have known, who moved through the world of intelligence services and financial crime with the ease of someone who belonged there. On June 19, 2020, the day after Wirecard admitted the money was gone, 4 days before Braun was arrested, Jan Marsalek boarded a private plane and disappeared. He has not been found since. German investigators believe he fled to Belarus with assistance from Russian intelligence. Documents later obtained by journalists and shared with European security authorities suggested Marsalek had been a source for Russian foreign intelligence, the GRU, for years, possibly for most of his time at Wirecard. Some investigators believe the Wirecard fraud was not purely a financial crime, that the network of fake revenues, offshore accounts, and falsified documents also served as infrastructure for intelligence operations, money laundering for interests that had nothing to do with payment processing. Marsalek remains on Interpol's most wanted list. Russia has denied knowledge of his whereabouts. In 2024, Markus Braun went on trial in Munich in what became one of the longest and most complex white-collar criminal proceedings in German history. The trial was expected to run for years, given the volume of evidence and the number of charges. The damage was vast. Wirecard's collapse wiped out roughly 12 billion euros in shareholder value in the final days of trading before insolvency. Pension funds, retail investors, institutional holders across Europe absorbed losses that will never be recovered. Employees who held stock as part of their compensation packages lost everything. And the institutions that were supposed to prevent exactly this kind of collapse came in for historic criticism. Ernst & Young faced investigations in Germany, the United Kingdom, and at European level for their failure to detect a fraud that, in retrospect, had significant and visible warning signs for years. The auditors had, it emerged, never directly confirmed the existence of the Philippine escrow accounts with the banks themselves, a basic verification step that any competent audit would require. BaFin, a German regulator, was eviscerated in a parliamentary inquiry. Members of the German parliament called it a systemic failure of supervision. The regulator had not only failed to investigate, it had actively used state power to suppress investigation by others. The FT journalists who had been subjected to a criminal probe for market manipulation were never charged. They received awards for their reporting instead. The German government, which had praised Wirecard as a national champion, ordered a reform of financial supervision. New rules were introduced, new structures were created. Whether these reforms will be sufficient is, as always, a question that will only be answered the next time. Because the pattern at the heart of the Wirecard story is not specific to Germany, it is not specific to Fintech, it is not even specific to this century. The pattern is this: when an institution is producing numbers that powerful people want to believe are real, those people will find ways to not look too closely. The auditors will give the benefit of the doubt, the regulators will pursue the critics rather than the company, the journalists who ask questions will be threatened to silence or discredited as agents of market manipulation, and the fraud will grow year by year until the number becomes so large that the fiction simply cannot hold. 1.9 billion euros that never existed. An auditor that signed off for 10 years without checking. A regulator that investigated the journalists. A chief operating officer who may have been working for Russian intelligence from the beginning. And a government that called it a success story. This is not an edge case. This is not an anomaly. This is what happens when a financial system optimizes for belief over truth. This is Dirty Ledger. I'll see you in the next one.